Work legally and ethically. In Australia, law is primarily the responsibility of the federal and state parliaments. Legislation or statutes are laws made by an act of parliament. Put simply, these are legal rules set out in a formal document. These laws will generally prohibit or direct behaviour or make a declaration. These laws can also be called statutory law. Regulations are rules that have the force of law and detail procedures for implementing legislation. While statutory law is passed by Parliament, common law, also known as case law or judge-made law, is developed over time by judges in response to a particular case in court. To decide what law applies in a given case, we must look to how it has been applied in similar cases in the past. Case law has the same legally binding effect as statutory law. Where there is no legislation, courts can establish law and can also interpret statutory law. Relevant common law concepts. Duty of care and negligence. Duty of care is a legal obligation in case law or common law which covers the safety and protection of people in a person's or organisation's care. Specifically, it is the duty to take reasonable care to avoid harm to people to whom you have a duty of care. For this reason, it is very relevant to work involving clients and volunteers. The protection of people extends to what is reasonably practicable. The harm would need to be reasonably foreseeable. A breach of the duty of care is called negligence. Who owes a duty of care? We all have a duty of care to take reasonable care for the well-being of people who we know may be harmed by our actions or inactions. Your relationship to the people around you dictates whether you have a duty of care or not. Those who perform work within an organisation, providing support to the community, must understand and fulfil their duty of care responsibility in the course of their work. This means that a person acting in a role involving care for others must act in a way to protect the client and to prevent foreseeable harm. A person must be able to demonstrate that all practicable and reasonable steps were taken to prevent harm. What is reasonable care, and when is a risk reasonably foreseeable? Reasonable care is the standard of care that an ordinary person in the same circumstances would think is reasonable. If a case went to court, for example, the judge would look at what other similar people, those with similar qualifications, knowledge or experience, would have done in the situation. Foreseeable harm is a risk that you knew or ought to have known existed. Some of the steps which an employer might take to fulfil their duty of care include the development and implementation of policies and procedures, professional development or training for all staff, and provision of supervision. Vicarious liability. Generally, organisations, including not-for-profits, will be held responsible for the actions of employees and volunteers. The legal responsibility of an employer for the negligence of their employees and volunteers is called vicarious liability. This means that an employer may be liable for damages if a person who is harmed by the negligent conduct of an employee or volunteer makes a claim. It is imperative that an organisation takes appropriate risk management steps to avoid inappropriate and harmful conduct by employees and volunteers and exposure to liability. The employer will not be liable if the behaviour of the employee or volunteer was either serious and willful misconduct or did not occur in the course of and did not arise out of the employment. Volunteers and liability. The Civil Liability Act 2002, New South Wales, protects volunteers from legal liability for any act or omission done by or made by the volunteer in good faith when engaged in community work. There are certain exceptions to this protection. Volunteers are not protected from legal liability if they were either engaging in criminal behaviour, consumed alcohol or drugs voluntarily, whether or not it was consumed for medication, and their ability to exercise reasonable care and skills was significantly impaired and the volunteer failed to exercise reasonable care and skills when doing the work, or when they acted outside the scope of the activities authorised by the community organisation or contrary to instructions given by the organisation.